true. I suppose I have become quite a familiar face in the city of late, and in Scotland, because thankfully we're doing now a few other projects around the country. I have developed over this time quite a taste for haggis. I have a couple of bottles of scotch in my cupboard back home in Amsterdam, which I have to say, over the course of this project, I've reached for on a couple of occasions. But I do draw the line at wearing a kilt because I've decided I don't have the legs for it. So, or the accent. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a privilege to be able to come and present the 2030 strategy to you today. Those of you who joined us last year may recall this scene as I was presenting the first stage of the strategy, which was probably the biggest study that's ever been done on the growth of the city or the development of Edinburgh and the development of its tourism industry and seeing how the two interrelate. A fascinating piece of work, exercise in itself. And that, of course, led to a huge amount of consultations later on with the industry, later the public, and then obviously into the drafting of the strategy itself, which has been going on over the past few months. So this was, of course, the early stage, and you may remember that we covered all kinds of subjects, and this is the thing, tourism, it turns out, is not quite as easy, let's say, as it used to be, at least from a planning and policy perspective. In fact, it's all becoming rather complex, but that's okay. But it means, of course, as visitors want to discover, they want to live more like a local, they want to spend more time in different parts of the city, and they want to obviously get more out of their visit, sometimes short visits. It means, of course, we have to take into account a whole range of different areas. And these are slides which, by the way, I showed last year, but there were a couple of key messages I wanted to bring out because I think we've had some pretty strong reminders over the past year or so, that this is certainly the case. Edinburgh certainly doesn't exist in a bubble. Well, that's certainly true. And when it comes to, for example, international issues, whether that is a virus in China, whether that's fluctuations in the currency rate, whether that is sometimes turbulent local or international politics, in the end, these things can become local issues, and they in the end affect, of course, how we have to plan and manage tourism locally. They end up having their impact. Sometimes decisions taken in boardrooms or parliaments, hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away, can really make an impact on visitors' expectations and what they expect to do in the city and whether they'll even come here or not. But I also said, and this was definitely a big quote from last year, big things are coming to Edinburgh. And as Roddy said at the very beginning, we were talking about, for example, the St. James Quarter. In the future, there'll be the waterfront. I suppose when I made this slide last year, I wasn't necessarily referring to the Christmas market, but that also was pretty big. And as we know, of course, sometimes as more things do in tourism these days, it has the propensity to put the cat among the pigeons, but it was also an extremely successful event which brought many people to the city. But that's the thing. Tourism, as we've already heard this afternoon, tourism is growing in a growing city. And that was essentially the conclusion of the first phase report that you saw. So yes, tourism is growing in a growing city. So what to do about that then? It's also growing essentially, in the UK. This is just issued last month by Visit Britain. This is the prediction that next year, 2020, will be a record year for international arrivals and international visitor spending in the UK. So that's quite significant. But the study that I mentioned found that actually only about 1 in 7 international visitors to the UK actually makes it to Scotland. Now, many of them are, of course, concentrated in Edinburgh. That's true. But if you think about obviously the small proportion of people coming here that also visit the UK. Meanwhile, we have things like this going on, and it's interesting. And of course, we're all in the process of trying to work out what on earth this means for us. This was only just a couple of weeks ago, a major new campaign among a growing number of tourism businesses that are recognizing fully the situation around global heating and various impacts on the environment, and of course are committed to doing something about it. So it takes something. Normally, of course, we've heard, of course, the City of Edinburgh Council has declared a climate emergency, the Scottish Government has, the government in Westminster too, and of course, but now we're talking about whole sectors, and we're talking about transnational businesses recognizing this. So it's true. Well, that's one aspect of the context that we're talking about. But as I said, and this is, I think, is going to be a continuing theme. It's many of the problems that we hear about, many of the challenges that we read about in the paper, are not down to tourism alone. They are down to the fact that it's urbanization. More and more people want to live in the city, and Edinburgh's population itself is expected to grow. And that's something which cities around the world are trying to deal with. But how is that often dealt with in the press? Especially the international press. And this is from CNN. This is from a network, actually, that usually takes quite a close interest in tourism in general, in tourism growth and its impacts. And very often, of course, we see the language of war and peace. It's often more of war rather than peace, unfortunately. And I suppose, this is a personal opinion, I tend to just find it rather unhelpful because it's not conducive to talking calmly about these issues, recognizing that we have differences of opinion and trying to find constructive ways forward. But okay, this is what people are reading, this is what they see. And as I said, it turns out that tourism as a sector is a lot more complex than sometimes the media give credit for. But it is also true in general, and this is the thing. Given all of that context, it's true that cities are recognizing fully that growth at all costs, just growth for the sake of it, doesn't really work for them. As visitor arrivals continue to grow and grow, we're sort of asking, okay, but what for? Now, of course, as Robin explained, he gave a very good explanation of what that really means to people's individual lives in Edinburgh. But of course, people have different experiences of that too, and if you're not, as Robin said, fully part of the success story, then that can be complex. So yeah, growth at all costs doesn't work. So in other words, then what is it that we're actually in the end trying to achieve? Well, in the course of the research, and this happened over in June this year, European Cities Marketing, which is an association of major and capital cities in Europe, has issued their own strategy. We're talking about here people who have spent most of their professional lives trying to encourage tourism growth in their cities. And their new strategy, which covers the next couple of years, has made a pretty powerful fundamental conclusion. And I'm going to share a quote with you now. So that is pretty powerful stuff from obviously a group of professionals whose generally their job is to, of course, encourage tourism growth and make that happen. And there's also another important conclusion that they've made then. Today, cities and stakeholders rightfully expect the visitor economy to contribute more to the quality of life and a lasting legacy in the city. So that means we're not just talking in terms of visitor arrivals and spending, as important as they are, not just concentrating on those as indicators of success alone, but it's important that tourism genuinely leaves a positive footprint afterwards. But that's complicated, and it's not an easy thing to make happen. So it's with taking that into account, as well as, of course, the description of Edinburgh's huge progress that Robin outlined just previously, that we took that into account when addressing the 2030 tourism strategy. We took a series of fundamental things into account. We knew that, for example, this had to be then a strategy that had to be built for the long term. Now, it turns out that so much has changed over the past year. Who really knows where we're going to be in 2030? It's not an easy prediction to make. And so whether it's, for example, viruses that can occur on the other side of the world, or obviously changes in spending and consumer habits among the UK population, in the end, we know that the strategy must still be of value pretty much whatever circumstances throw at us. It's also true that in the end, what are we here for? What are we, of course, trying to achieve? The city does have wider goals. And so when we were looking around for a series of objectives, because every strategy has got to have some objectives, we looked around and we thought, okay, we could sort of try and craft our own. And then we realized actually the city already has some, and they're articulated pretty well in the city's economy strategy. Now, I don't know if you have a copy laying on your bedside table to read before you nod off every evening, but it looks something like this. And these are the 8 enablers of good growth. So essentially, we're talking about number 3 there. We're talking about, for example, supporting the city's transition to a low-carbon economy, to being the most entrepreneurial city, and then, of course, to things like being a world-class place to power the city's economy. So looking very much at the sense of place and ensuring that the city still remains attractive to all of those who want to come here. now, of course, you may be wondering, okay, tourism can't solve all of these things. But, and here's the point, it's important that tourism makes its contribution and that we become more and more creative in finding ways to address these. So indeed, yeah, we're not going to be able to, of course, solve all of these. This is the Council's economy strategy. But it does give us pretty good frame of reference to working out, okay, what is it as a sector ultimately we're trying to achieve? So, in the end, and this is another fundamental shift and a fundamental difference between the previous strategy and this new one, is a big shift in driving growth, because growth is expected, to managing growth. Now, we looked at all sorts of different indicators, and it does show us, as I showed you the graph from Visit Britain not long ago, that growth on the whole is expected from visitors coming from emerging outbound markets, as well as, of course, a lot more UK visitors are visiting because we're spending much more of our money on leisure experiences rather than stuff. Just look at the retail environment as well, and that'll show you what you need to know. So, therefore, if growth is expected, we have to try and make it work better for the city. But, and I hear you ask, what on earth happens then if growth doesn't come? What do we do with the strategy? Well, my argument is that the strategy still works because it addresses things like reducing our environmental footprint, making a better contribution to try and help people into work and, of course, to improve places and the cultural life in the city. So ultimately, the strategy is perhaps a little bit more inward-looking in the sense that it's aiming to do better for the city. So I said that it's a strategy for the city. It doesn't belong to one particular agency. It was very kindly facilitated, of course, by the Strategy Implementation Group. It was commissioned by ETAG, and I have to say, with a huge amount of patience and good grace and working across the city as well. But it was facilitated by ETAG, but this is a strategy for the city, and the idea is that this is something which multiple agencies, including businesses as well as the public sector agencies that are involved, can take their lead from this and see where they should focus their time and energy. So I guess you're kind of wondering, for those of you who haven't seen it, and of course it was out in a public consultation not long ago, just to give you a very quick idea of what's in it. It's articulated in terms of a series of ambitions, as well as a range of recommendations, and then some suggested indicators for success, which are going to be developed now onwards. And this is we look at some major priorities, and every single priority starts with this statement. Towards 2030, we are going to nurture and develop these elements. So they're not necessarily any priority order because they're all important, they're all rather different as well, and it's all up to different people to address them. But what do we mean when we're talking about our place? Essentially, the idea is to make sure we continue to nurture and develop Edinburgh as an attractive place to live and work, and therefore making it an attractive place to visit. If people visiting here see that local people are happy and that they enjoy a good quality of life, and the city offers an authentic welcome, then of course it will be an attractive place to visit. The idea, of course, then, is we're nurturing and developing our people. What does this mean? Essentially, the idea is that the ultimate beneficiaries of the strategy should be the people of Edinburgh, and that they, of course, the strategy will then help to contribute to a good quality of life, and that residents can benefit from a thriving tourism sector too. As Robin said, a thriving tourism sector in this city has helped, of course, to improve the quality of life for many people. While, of course, we must recognize that there are certain specific issues, and this is another way in which this strategy is new. We make a firm recognition that tourism can create negative situations and impinge on negatively on people's quality of life in certain ways, and therefore it's really important to directly address those challenges. So one of the aspects of this is that residents and visitors are encouraged to respect and care for the city. So it's important that we get creative and work together in addressing those. The environment, I suppose back in the day, and this is certainly no criticism of this was the case for strategies for many years. The word environment was, of course, mixed in with the word sustainability, and it was often tacked on at the end as a bit of a sort of polite afterthought. But that's not the case anymore, and we're placing it fairly and squarely at the center of this strategy. So the whole idea is that as a sector, of course, the city has a commitment to reduce its carbon footprint, and as a sector, it is absolutely vital that we make a huge contribution to that effort. So much of a lot of this strategy in the future is going to be about when we talk about businesses and helping businesses to work out how to do this. It's also important that we recognize that apart from the beautiful built heritage, the city has quite a lot of natural heritage too, and a huge, wonderful environment for visitors to be able to enjoy. I have to say, the other day, talking about this, I did take my first ever trip up Arthur's Seat the other morning when the sun was up, but I went up the side that was in the shade, so it was frozen, and so it was me as well as a lot of Chinese tourists in their expensive trainers. It was a bit like Saving Private Ryan, trying to sort of get up on the grass at the side. But I survived the experience, and it was very beautiful. But it's true, I don't think people used to take many trips up there in January, but that's climate change for you. But it is true, we have to recognize that it's everybody's responsibility, and especially the tourism sectors, to make sure that we contribute more and more to making this city a cleaner and a healthier one. We'll also develop our partnerships. What does this mean? Well, of course, to address the issues that we've been discussing, to remain resilient and flexible in the future, we'll have to make sure that we work harder and faster together. Harder and faster than was probably the case in the past. This is going to involve a lot more stronger dialogue, and as the second point says here, we need to find some really effective ways to make sure that we promote a very strong dialogue with residents, especially around specific challenges. And of course then, and this is another dimension to this strategy which is new, it's about making friends and forming relationships with other destinations in the surrounding area, beyond Edinburgh and in the rest of Scotland. That word dispersal we hear a lot. It's not as easy as we'd like to think, but it is important. And if you look at the concentration of bed nights and of spending in Scotland, it's highly, highly concentrated in Edinburgh. And it's, I think, incumbent on all of us to see how we can work more to try and retain more spending in the Scottish economy from that. So on the final point then about reputation. So it's not necessarily, we didn't use the word brand, we didn't use marketing, but it's about making sure of our reputation, that we defend our reputation. First of all, we have to define our reputation, and I know a lot of work has been done around the 2050 vision on that. We have to define our reputation. Sometimes we have to defend our reputation because, as we know, as talked about the press there, the eyes of the world are on Edinburgh, and people are asking serious questions about what it is like to be a visitor, and more importantly, what it's like to be a resident in this city. So we have to get out there and explain our approach with confidence, obviously based on solid actions. And it's also therefore important to ensure that we concentrate on the things that really do enhance our reputation, our products and our commitment to quality. And, of course, as I've said in small brackets there, we have to challenge sometimes misperceptions and sometimes fake news and fake statistics that we see out there. We have to recognize that this is happening, and we have to be honest about it, and we have to find creative ways together to beat some of these myths as well. So during the public consultation that happened around this strategy, we asked people, okay, what do you think of those themes? And many of them resonated very strongly with people. We think the partnerships one was probably a bit lower. Perhaps people were a little bit suspicious, especially residents, a little bit suspicious about what some of those partnerships, who they were between and what they were leading to. When you work in strategies, you know, of course, partnerships are essential to making the strategy work. So it's important that we, of course, include residents more and more. And I have to say, a diverse range of residents. This is something we're going to have to work very hard at, making sure that we have a wide-ranging representation of residents from not just the centre but beyond as well, to understand how they feel about tourism and what it does for the city in different ways. And of course, obviously, about the reputation as well. So I wanted to sort of keep this relatively light and simple because strategies can sometimes be quite heavy documents. But I wanted to just talk about what are some of the opportunities. What does this really mean for us? Well, first of all, in the end, this is a huge opportunity, and one that's probably gone rather unaddressed on the whole, is our huge opportunity to work with our neighbours. Of course, the other side of the Forth, but also in other ways as well. Working with other cities globally to understand, as we're going to today, to understand how they deal with some of these issues and what are some of the lessons that we can take away from that. We have a huge opportunity in here to work better for our people, to ensure that work and jobs offer fairer conditions for our people. There's a lot of businesses out there doing brilliant things, and it's really important that we can learn from them and understand how, of course, we can treat workers in the tourism industry much better. I think that, when we think of young people and their attitudes to the workplace, of course, they don't just select it on salary these days. The way the company behaves as a whole is a really important consideration in that, and that's something we have to take on board as well. So we also have then a huge opportunity as well in terms of strengthening local supply chains, making sure that the wonderful food and drink that this country produces enters much more of the supply chains in the city as well, and that we really do help to keep local visitor spending local, because then that benefits the city as a whole, of course. When it comes to the environment, we have this opportunity, but this is also a competitive opportunity to, of course, reduce the environmental impact, to become more efficient in the way we run our businesses. And then, of course, we know that often, actually, when it comes to consumers, they're often ahead of us, ahead of the game on this stuff, and they really are demanding huge change and responsibility by businesses. So we know that there is this demand there, and it's up to us to react to it. And then if we do it well, and I really do believe that we can lead, then we can show others how it's done. We have to get a lot smarter, and there's a lot of work already being done around data, around measuring tourism flows. This is something that's fast-moving, it's evolving in different ways, but we have to get a lot better and at making sure we manage this and work together to try and solve some of the city's specific issues, so that we can manage the city better for all, and ultimately, of course, learn much more about our visitors to ensure that we really are giving them what they're looking for. And also, when we talk about reputation, we can, often, of course, we see, I chose this image on purpose. We didn't necessarily just want to show, we always see the same photo of the center, the historic center, the castle. And of course, we do have a huge opportunity to help really open people's eyes as to what they can do in a visit to Edinburgh. And hopefully, as a result of this, of course, they'll actually stay longer, get more from their visit, and often leads to a slightly lower impact visit as a whole. And my final message this afternoon is that we really do have the opportunity to lead. There is no tourism strategy in the UK that looks like this. This is, we hope, going to be a really leading strategy for a city which has led in innovation for so long. So we really believe that it is possible for Edinburgh's tourism sector as a whole to show that tourism genuinely can make a positive contribution to places in what is, of course, quite a complex world. So I do want to take this opportunity to thank all of those people who have contributed to getting us to where we are today with the strategy, and the huge amount of work that's gone into this from all sides. I want to thank Mags, Gillian, and Kim at ETAG for the huge amount of patience and hard work that has gone into coordinating all of this. And I want to thank you for listening. So I look forward to accompanying you in the future on this. Thank you.